Welcome to Encounter, where we celebrate putting faith into action and community leaders who live out compassion, grace, and love. We're a program of the Broome County Council of Churches that addresses food insecurity through CHOW and the Greater Good Grocery, provides hospital and jail ministry, builds wheelchair ramps, and assists neighbors with transportation and shopping services through Faith in Action volunteers. We invite you to the conversation. Encounter your neighbors as we learn to walk together in love and kindness.
Good morning and welcome to Encounter. I'm your host today, Joe Sellepack, Executive Director at the Broome County Council of Churches. There are lots of different ways that ministers divide their time and things that they do in order to keep a church or keep a community active. There are two different types of ministries that go on within the Council of Churches. We have some of us are very active within congregations, and then we also have chaplains. Chaplains are a specific calling within under that whole pastoral care rubric, and so we're going to talk a little bit about what is the difference between pastoral ministry within a congregation and what's involved in being a chaplain in an institution, and what the differences, similarities, and all that kind of thing that kind of goes on within these ministry settings. To help me have this conversation is Reverend John Snider, who is newly he's just come on as a 20-hour-a-week chaplain at UHS hospitals under Rachel Helgeson is our lead chaplain, but John is he's also a chaplain. She's lead chaplain. What's your title now?
Well, I'm chaplain.
Chaplain.
Just
chaplain.
Yeah,
there you go.
Primary contact for palliative care, and then part of my new role is also to work on recruiting of chaplains, volunteer chaplains for the hospital.
For the hospital, and so we'll talk a little bit about volunteer chaplains and their role too within your programs, and of course, no stranger to Encounter is the Reverend Dr. Cris Mogenson, who is our jail ministry chaplain. You've been doing this for a long time, right, Cris?
Just a couple of weeks would be 24 years.
24 years this year. So. Congratulations on reaching that milestone. We're very proud of the work that you do in the jail. So let's start off by talking a little bit about that question. What is the difference between pastoral ministry within a congregation and then what you do in your role as chaplain?
Well, in a congregation, you've got people that have come there on their own volition. They're seeking something. They've joined this group. They belong in that fellowship, and so and also the pastor is serving not just that one group but the whole community as well. But they come in there on their own accord. As a chaplain, at least, is certainly in hospital and corrections. This is a group that has not come there by their own choice. Typically, circumstances, either health or other legal circumstances that brought them into your congregation. So the focus is much more narrow. And you're basically on their turf.
Right.
And you have to be very, very careful about violating their space and their emotional barriers as well. And so the technique of ministering to them is quite different.
Yeah, I think as a pastor, I look at it as I'm doing a longer journey with them. My hope is it's a lifelong journey with them. I want to baptize their children. I want to marry their children. You know what I mean? I want to be with them and do like a long-term life with them and be in community with them. Whereas when I'm in a hospital, it's sometimes could be only one interaction or just a group of interactions that I have. To have an impact, and so really it changes the way I approach it, my thoughts around it, maybe even the cadence at which I would move into things with a person.
Because, well, especially under when you're talking palliative care,
Yeah.
you're palliative being, end of life care. That's an incredibly narrow period of time, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you're just
Yeah, you might have 9 days if you're lucky.
Right.
You know what I mean? You know what I mean? It's just a really short window and a small opportunity to really be present and to minister and answer their questions and just reassure them that they've made the right decision. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. And that might be one of the differences between hospital, where you're dealing with like that narrow window. You have that moment. You have that interaction, and you're in more of a residential setting, right?
Yeah, and there's also, we call it corrections, but unfortunately there's a lot of punitive things going on too.
Right.
And there's also a lot of baggage of guilt and remorse that come with it. And in chaplaincy, we're kind of using psychology, religion, theology, spirituality, which are all a little bit different, and a lot of social science skills in order to help them come to some answers, come to some self-realization. We're not there to proselytize. That's a problem. But where there is a ministry of presence. And sometimes we hear stuff that's just really wacky theology. Something from Uncle Bob last Thanksgiving, or Grandma that used to force them to go to church and they didn't want to be there. Some novels that are they look historical about Jesus but are not. So there's a lot of stuff that people come in with, and you have to bite your tongue when you hear some of this like really strange stuff. But we need to, and sometimes we come into their presence and we are not welcome because of all of that influence in the past. But we avail ourselves to them, and when they are ready, they'll ask. And sometimes it's very small things, phone calls or help or guidance on things. Can't do legal guidance, but and eventually, a lot of times the spiritual questions will surface. At any given time, about 1/3 of those inmates are seeking my office.
Now, one of the things that you had said in your originally, and I want to pick up on it again, is that you're allowing that person to define the boundaries.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you let that person understand and be the person who tells you what they need and what they require, and how you can be that gift of presence in the midst of that. How difficult is that?
Well, sometimes, like Cris mentioned, like you meet people and like their theology or their belief and their spirituality is kind of might be a hodgepodge.
Right.
And so to not be there, I'm not there to necessarily correct them.
Right.
I'm there to meet them where they're at and then help them emotionally and spiritually. And I meet all different faith traditions too. So it's a whole broad spectrum of faith traditions you see. And so you have to meet that person where they're at.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
As a coordinating chaplain, I have to make sure that everybody has access to their own faith and practices. And sometimes it's a big learning curve. I've got to really study this stuff. But there are certain things certain practices or accoutrements and so forth might be a security risk. But this thing called Religious Land Use for Institutionalized Persons Act, which is a nightmare for chaplains trying to get our arms around this thing. It's a big rubric. We're always trying to figure out what to do. I have to find the least restrictive means for these people to be able to worship in their own tradition. And there are sometimes other Christian pastors look at the coordinating chaplain like an apostate,
Right.
But I deal with that. But I have to make sure that everybody has access. And then along with that, I do a lot of practical stuff like, facilitating dog rescues, people coming off of buses when the parents been arrested, cars that have been pounded and notarized letters for people to get money out of the bank and so forth. They do a lot of that stuff too.
Now, one of the things that I remember, like last year, I think toward the end of the year, there was a person who was incarcerated who was of Chinese ancestry.
Yeah.
And they, their parents didn't speak English very well. And they wanted to know how their child was doing, but their child was incarcerated in the Broome County Jail. And so your office had to kind of be that translator back and forth between the people at home and the person who was in the jail, just to relieve the mother of her anxiety over, you know, how her child was being treated. You know, we were talking about a 21.
Yeah.
I always feel really bad, especially for adult males, because our brains aren't fully developed until we're much
26 or something.
Yeah, much older than that, and people make stupid choices, and sometimes those choices land you inside of jail. You know that this person has a strong family background and people care for him. They're not going to probably be the lifelong.
Hopefully.
Hopefully not the lifelong incarcerated individual over a course of their life, but you know, this is just a blip, so to speak. Can you talk a little bit about about that role that you do?
Yeah, unfortunately, to tag along with that, the Prison Policy Initiative just released a study, came out yesterday, that 3 days in jail increases your risk of incarceration dramatically in the future, even after everything's cleared out. 5 days, it triples that from 3.
Oh, wow.
And there are some people 5 years out and they still haven't gotten their job and their life back together because of that stay in jail. The stigma that goes with it, the loss of documentation, loss of cars, loss of a job, it's extraordinarily bad. This is where bail reform is not a bad thing. And by the way, the data out there is not indicating that bail reform is that bad on crime, okay? It actually helps in a lot of other ways. But,
well, especially if you take that thousand view, not the anecdotal stuff, because all the people can come up with an anecdotal kind of thing that says, right, this is why bail reform is bad. But when you look at it in terms of the larger picture, like what you're talking about, you end up with a totally different story, right?
Yeah, and then helping these people and the families and readjust and so forth, like you were talking about, you know, reconnecting families. Sometimes people just go missing. They have no idea where they're at. I had a phone call yesterday. Is my son there?
Right.
They had no idea. The person's disappeared for a few days. And sometimes I could figure it out with search sites. I could figure, well, okay, he's at Tioga County Jail, whatever. Reconnecting families, though, is extraordinarily important. One of the things that we do is a family literacy program where we have inmates read books onto recorders. I burn them onto a CD, send the book and the CD to the guardian. And a few years back, I met 2 grandparents, and their daughter was now in college, and they had this CD, and or it was a tape then, but they were still listening to it.
Right.
Yeah, but the little things like that are just really important. But we try to do some life skills and spirituality classes, trying to get these people to refocus what their priorities were and so forth, and relationships. And we try to connect people with congregations that are welcoming. We've got several dozen of them in the community that are willing to work with us on that.
Right.
But reconnecting them with the congregation that can mentor them and their families. And the biggest problem we have is substance use disorders.
Right.
That's huge, and that's really not a nefarious thing. It's something that they've gotten caught into. It's not necessarily criminal-like behavior, but once they get onto that train, it's hard to get off of that.
It really does.
And we incarcerate thinking that's the best way to. I mean, you lock someone up in a concrete bathroom for 7 weeks, and you know, we wonder why that doesn't help. Yeah, that's not good.
My guests today are Reverend John Snider, who pastors at Two Rivers Church, but also he's on staff, executive pastor at Two Rivers Church. Yeah. And then also is a hospital ministry chaplain. and Reverend Dr. Cris Mogenson, who is our lead chaplain in the jail. So one of the thoughts that I had about hospital ministry has to do with families as well. So while Cris is talking about ministering to a family, connecting people, I would imagine that given the logistics around family and the dynamics in families, you find your role shifting by the folks who come into.
Yeah, even by the room you walk into.
Right.
You know what I mean? And in the conditions of the room and the dynamics of the family come into play too.
Yeah.
I can be with a patient who is just got a cancer diagnosis.
Right.
You know, I can be with a couple that just lost their first child in early pregnancy, you know, or I can be with a family that's losing their dad or their mom or their child, and the dynamics of meeting the family where they're at, and each person has a different spot at where they're at. There's all different dynamics inside of the family, and some of that, especially when we're dealing with palliative care, some of that plays out
right
over the course of the 4 or 5 days.
How does it play out?
Well, I've seen it play out in a lot of different ways, like because I mean, there's a lot of anxiety around death. There's anger, and so that plays out in the fact that sometimes they're hashing out stuff that,
right.
You know what I mean? Maybe they should just let it go.
It's like baggage that they're carrying, and they can't let it go because they still are emotionally attached to it, right?
Yeah, they're emotionally attached to, and I oftentimes have to help people say, like, hey, this is probably the end for them, and this is probably the time to, like, say the things you need to say.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Don't leave things unsaid, and maybe this is the time to forgive whatever that thing is you're carrying. Maybe release that for yourself and for them.
Because you're even dealing at that point with people who are at varying levels of cognitive ability too, right?
Oh yeah, because there's a lot of confusion. You can have a discussion with a wife about her husband and what's going on, and then come back 4 hours later, and it's almost like you didn't even have the discussion.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like, because they're confused, they're overwhelmed, they're upset. And sometimes they only can hear what they can hear.
Right.
Or want to hear.
Or want to hear or ready to hear.
Yeah. Before I was when we were talking before this show, before we started recording the show, I talked a little bit about an experience that I had with a pastoral call with a church member who was in a palliative care unit. So it was a person who was dying themselves, but right next door was somebody who was coding. And so the coding, there was a trauma that I was involved in, you know, just dealing with the family while this other coding is going on. But then on top of that, the social worker was there trying to get the wife of the man who was coding to sign a do not resuscitate order. And all they wanted to do was get them to sign the dotted line. It wasn't until the chaplain showed up and actually started interacting with the person that they got to the point where they were there, where they went through all the emotional process that moment was kind of requiring of them, to the point where they were able to think rationally about what they needed to do, because you know what it's like when you're inside of that fight or flight mode. You know, you just can't function within it, and it's like you're being asked to make and especially with older people, you know, you're asking them to make a choice or a decision when their emotions are way up here, and they're not able to think rationally about it. It's just putting a person almost in an impossible position, and I would imagine that that's part of what your job is.
And you face that for people a lot. They're in it's an impossible decision. Like, it's a loved one.
Right.
Like, it's their spouse, it's their child. It is an impossible moment. You know what I mean? It's the worst moment.
Yeah.
It is the worst moment.
Yep.
And so how we navigate the worst moment. Oftentimes when I walk into a room, I try to think of this. If that was my mom and my dad, or that's my sister, You know what I mean? That's my niece. Like, I put myself in their position.
Right.
And what would I need? What would I want? How would I, and I am a Christian, so I believe in this idea to love God and love people. And so I am there to love them and meet them where they're at and administer to what they need in that moment.
And I think that's the special role of chaplaincy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's incarnational ministry.
Right.
It's being the presence of God. You're representing our Lord. And it's not necessarily proselytizing or representing, one particular narrow group. You're coming in there, you're representing the love and the forgiveness and the presence of God. And it's a very frightening role, very humbling.
Yeah.
And, and we don't want to mess that one up because the results can be catastrophic.
Right.
And it's fearful.
Right, and as pastoral ministry, when I'm doing life with somebody, I will leverage my relationship to help provide correction oftentimes.
Right.
I'm almost never doing that as a chaplain. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
You know what I mean?
I
That is not my role. So there is definitely a dynamic difference between being a pastor and pastoring someone over a lifetime versus these interactions in ministry of presence.
You only have a little time.
Yeah.
Yeah, ministry of presence. I love that line because you are in a way embodying God and God's presence within that moment. And yet, just as Jesus was fully God, fully human, when you're starting to talk about emotional, when we're talking about incarnational ministry, but there is an emotional cost to the chaplain.
Oh, yes.
Too, in the midst of that, isn't there?
Oh, no,
Yes,
for
yes,
sure.
yeah.
For sure.
You want to talk a little bit about that? Because we are not God. That's the whole point, right?
Right. And there is a trauma that you carry from these interactions. When you're with a family and they're getting the worst diagnosis, or you're in the moments. Death is very rarely pretty. Do you know what I mean? What the body does is very rarely. The thought that a person just falls asleep and there's nothing else is not my experience. That does happen sometimes, and so that is, that trauma. There's a trauma there that as you walk through with that family that you carry out of there.
Right.
And for me, that's just something certain ones I just got to process them.
Yeah, I remember doing as a hospital chaplain. There was a teenager in the ER late at night. And it was my first overnight, and the doctors were joking afterwards. I thought, how callous. But then I realized that they were hurting so bad, they had to turn to humor to try to anesthetize that pain. And actually, humor is a lot in my office with my other chaplains. A lot of that goes on. But you got to step back. You got to step back. And I find my solace is music.
Yeah.
And our Catholic chaplain, he'll go for a walk around the building, or, well, not all the building, but off in the grounds and outside. But you have to take a breather. You've got to
disconnect somehow.
Yeah, you have to.
Yeah.
There's a lot of secondary trauma that we actually deal with.
Well, yeah. Now, and so one of the big issues that comes up right now is this issue of not only secondary trauma, which is interesting, but also religious trauma.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And so you're dealing with two. Those are two big things. One is more of what you deal with, but then when a person comes into a jail or into the hospital with religious trauma, then that even adds another
and there's a lot of
dimension.
Church hurt. A lot of people come in and it's a person, or you know what I mean, or the corporate church that in their view that hurt them,
or a TV preacher.
Yeah. And so like you meet them in that, and sometimes you have to disarm that if you're going to get into conversation.
Right.
You know what I mean? And ask them, process that with them.
Yeah.
So that you can go to the next level where you can, now we can maybe talk about what you're dealing with emotionally or spiritually.
Yeah. And how big is that in the jail?
Oh, it's huge.
Yeah.
It's huge. A lot of misconceptions out there, a lot of anger. And then, of course, a lot of folks are blaming God for their situation, too.
So they may put down on the card, "I'm a Catholic," but then you find out that this person actually hasn't been practicing, and the reason that they haven't been practicing for a long period of time is this deep woundedness that has accompanied them through life.
And some of these folks will change religions like a pair of socks, trying to try out what works the best, and makes religious diets a nightmare for me. So.
Yeah, so in our last couple of minutes together, let's talk a little bit about how a person might be able to, John, you had indicated that you were working toward recruiting volunteers that would come into the hospital. How might a volunteer who feels called to chaplaincy be involved with your program?
Well, the first step would be to give us a call. I actually wrote the number down so I would have it for you today. If you can call our offices at 607-762-2446, and you can ask for Rachel or myself. And then there's an application process through the hospital. There's a background check, there's some physical requirements, and then there's some interviewing requirements too. And then you would round, there's some training, round numerous times with multiple chaplains until the point where you're released to do the 2 hours is usually the minimum commitment weekly. We're going to have some events this fall where we're going to actually offer opportunities for people to come in. We're going to be hosting them in some local churches. You come in, you can meet some of our chaplains. You can hear more in depth about kind of what the role looks like, what chaplaincy is. I believe that so many people, God instills a purpose and plan and gifts in each and every person, and there's a whole host of people out there that have this gifting, have an ability, and they can actually get involved and utilize those gifts and really make a change for people's lives for the good, and really utilize those gifts that they have. And we'd love to help equip them, help them walk into that ability to volunteer at either Wilson or Binghamton General Hospital.
And Cris, I know that we're very short on time, but as far as your program, how might somebody connect with you?
Well, they can email the council. Barbara will send me the forms. Or they can call the chaplain's office, 778-6518. And I will send a PDF, active PDF. It's an application for security background release. Fill that out, I send that in. They run a local check. You come in for fingerprints, they run a national check. Once that's cleared, you take a class, a briefing class, or a security class. And then I'll take out for coffee in the process. We'll talk together. I'll connect you with an existing team to shadow them before you break away with it.
And you can find out all about this at www.broome, with an E, B-R-O-O-M-E, council, COUNCIL.net. I want to thank both Reverend Dr. Cris Mogenson and Reverend John Snider for being on Encounter today. And for all of you, I hope that you would be good and gentle with each other today. Have a great day.